Hello, my intrepid art sluts. This is Allison Moon, and you're listening to Artgasm, the podcast all about the intersections of sexuality and art. On today's episode, we have a little bit of a love letter to journalism. I sit down with Michael Schulman, who you might remember from episode 6, I think, where we talked all about the movie Call Me By Your Name. On this episode, I sit down with him and we talk all about his job as a journalist. I'm a writer, as you probably know, and what I love about journalism is how foreign it feels to me. I love editing nonfiction and journalism, but I find it to be such a unique skill set, particularly in the interview process. And so I talk a lot to Michael about how he prepares for interviews, how he tries to get maybe more nuanced or possibly more intimate details from people's lives, including celebrities, and his different strategies for working with that. And we talk a lot about consent and sexuality, and it's all really, really good stuff. So I am excited about this episode, and I'm excited to share it with you. A little bit of a caveat. I recorded this when I was in New York, and we were sitting next to a window overlooking 2nd Avenue. So there are sirens, there's traffic noise, there's just basically New York. You will enjoy the sounds of New York. Just be aware that that's the case, and that's just fine. I am currently in New York right now as well, the city that I consider my second home, saying goodbye to the actual home in that second home. My partner has kept his apartment for years, and we are finally surrendering the lease, which is... I'm having some feelings. I've talked a lot about place and my relationship to place. I'm sure everybody, to some degree, feels different kinds of relationships around intimacy. When it comes to leaving a home, it always feels almost identical to me to breaking up with someone, or to losing a partner or a romantic partner for some reason. I don't know why it is, but I have that same part of my brain that feels loss around the loss of a relationship, the loss of a love, or the loss of the potential of a relationship. It's exactly the same neural pathways that get fired up whenever I have to say goodbye to a place. This place has served us well. This place has served my partner well for decades. And so we're cleaning, and I'm just up to my elbows in ancient grease, and it's really gross, but feels really soothing. It's sad and fine all at the same time. Anyway, so I thought it would be appropriate to have an interview that I conducted in New York with a New Yorker as this episode. A couple of little news pieces. Speaking of journalism, there was recently a death in the journalism community, and I just wanted to honor her. Nikki Delamotte was a journalist in Cleveland, and she worked for a number of different Cleveland publications. Cleveland is my hometown, and I never met Nikki, but she knew we had a lot of friends in common, and she was the arts and cultural editor for a number of different publications, and she recently died a violent death of a gunshot wound. As of now, there are no details as to who killed her or why. But I just wanted to send my condolences to all of her fans and her family and anybody whose lives she touched. She sounded like she was a really wonderful person, according to all of the tributes that I'm reading. And I think there's such value in doing arts and culture journalism in smaller cities. I think that when we talk about journalism around the arts, we're thinking often about big stars, big movies, big productions in the big cities. And I think so often, especially these days with budget cuts around a lot of free weeklies and journalism in general being in jeopardy in so many different ways, I think it's really important to honor the local journalism, the people who talk about what's special about your town, the people who go to see all these works and write about the different cultural happenings in towns. I think that is in some ways what keeps those cultures alive and what keeps people feeling connected to their local community instead of always just sitting at home and watching Netflix. And God knows that pull is strong for me. I think often when I'll read a piece about the art that's happening in my community, it certainly inspires me to go out and seek those artists and engage with my neighbors and engage with my community members in my city. And Nikki was part of that, and a lot of local journalists are part of that. And so I just want to thank people who hustle in that environment to keep bringing people together. So rest in peace, Nikki. Thank you for the work that you did, and my condolences to everyone who she touched. Another a little bit more higher profile death today. Stan Lee died. And this does actually kind of dovetail into this theme of the episode because of journalism. I met Stan Lee once when I was working in Los Angeles. I met a lot of celebrities when I worked in Hollywood. There were a couple that stuck with me, though, and Stan was one of them, because I wrote interview questions for him. He was doing a live Q&A. And I got to write the interview questions for the interviewer to do. And it was fun. So before the Q&A started, Stan and I were just kind of hanging around and shooting the shit. And that was cool. He was a little flirty in a very gentlemanly way. But I'm like, hello, you sweet, dirty old man, you. And he was very kind and respectful and very cheeky at the same time, which is kind of my jam. And so we chatted for a while, kind of just waiting for things to get started. And so I was able to kind of gather some more information before I compiled all the last questions for the interviewer. And I just remember it being a moment that was really sweet to me because of his just genuine enthusiasm for the world. There was no cynicism in that man. There was no overitism. There was no, I'm a huge celebrity, so get the fuck out of my way. He was just a cool guy who treated some nobody 24-year-old with respect, which I think is a good sign, I know that he left behind a lot of people who loved him for his work, who loved him as a man, who loved him in both ways, and I think that's all real wonderful, and we should all be so lucky as to live to 95 and have such a legacy to leave behind. So thank you, Stan Lee, for the work that you've done. I also, if you're interested in hearing more from different people about their perspectives on Stan Lee's work and Marvel's work in general, I would recommend checking out episode 7 of this podcast, my conversation with Baruch Porras Hernandez. He talks a lot about being a young, gay Mexican Chicano and discovering queerness through the X-Men. And I think that the X-Men is incredibly symbolic for a huge swath of people, the outsiders, the freaks, but particularly for queers, LGBT folks. And Baruch talks so elegantly about seeing people of his race represented positively, seeing people of his sexual persuasion represented positively, and then in the character of Richter, who is a Mexican gay man, and that character was incredibly inspiring to Baruch. So I recommend checking out that episode if you want to hear, again, these first-person accounts of how creative works of fiction can truly change people's lives. Yeah. So I learned from that conversation with Stan how to ask good questions, because I certainly did not do a great job of it. And you know what? In my conversation with Michael Schulman that you're about to hear, I'm learning how to ask better questions, and Michael taught me some really great tips. So if you're the kind of person who's ever in the position of interviewing people or just having a conversation where you're trying to get to the truth of something, I recommend continuing to listen to this episode, because I know I can be a fairly loquacious person, and I am what psychologists call an external processor, which means that I tend to talk until I get to the point, because I have not yet figured out the point when I start talking. It is through the process of discussing that I figure out what I actually believe about something, which is different from some people who don't say anything until they already know what they want to say. Maybe this is why I'm a podcaster or an educator, but it's certainly something that I find that I do, and I can hear myself do it in a lot of interviews where I start asking something, and I will change my tack, and then I will come back around again, and then by the time I get to the end of it, maybe I figured out exactly what question I want to ask, which is not always the best tactic for getting to the truth of something. It's something that I'm learning how to do better, and I will always be learning how to do better. I enjoy the art of conversation, but I would like to be able to get to more succinct ways of developing intimacy with people through conversation. So, we'll see if I ever get there. Cool. So without further ado, allow me to introduce Michael Schulman. He is a writer. He's written for a bunch of different stuff. The New Yorker is one of his main publications. He name drops a bunch of the different articles that he's written. I recommend checking out some of them. A lot of his celebrity profiles are really great, too. So listen, see what you think. And as always, feel free to respond here on Twitter at HeyAllieMoon, or share your thoughts with me at argasmcast@gmail.com. All right. Enjoy. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
So, we met
on a bus on the way to Camp John Waters. And I was so excited that I basically cock-blocked everyone from sitting next to me, because then I got to sit next to you on the bus. And you were like the most interesting person, because you're a journalist.
No, I wasn't the most interesting person there by a mile.
That's very fair enough. That was a freaky bus. That was a freaky bus. And
it was
God
a
bless.
freaky weekend. It was amazing.
It was amazing.
There were that crowd, it was John Waters summer camp for 3 days in Connecticut. With what were the activities again? It was
there was a Baltimore pub crawl,
Bloody Mary bingo, costume contest where everyone dressed up like Divine and Edith Massey and everything, and it was crazy. It was crazy, and the people there was a really self-selecting group.
I really think it made me want more, specifically summer camps for film nerds, because it was a weird Venn diagram of indoor kids, but at the same time there was archery.
Yeah. No, that's what was so weird about it. There was it was climbing wall, arts and crafts, burlesque.
Yeah.
Actually on the last day, that amazing woman, Kat, who's one of the counselors, one of the campers, she didn't even work there. She taught a burlesque class on the basketball court.
Yeah.
It was just such a crazy. That's why I wanted to write this article. I was there for the New York Times style section and got to just interview everyone, and so you were the first person I met.
Yeah, that was really fun. Yeah, and chatting with you was so great because do you identify as a journalist primarily?
Yeah.
Okay. And so, what do you consider your beat? What's?
Oh gosh, well, I try not to be too specific. I mostly arts and culture, I would say. I write for a couple of different places. I write for The New Yorker a lot about theater and movies, and then for the style section of the Times, more about, celebrity, sexuality, all sorts of things. What category does Camp John Waters fall into? It was just a cool scene that I wanted to check out. But I would say more counterculture for the style section. I profiled people like Grace Jones and Alan Cumming and Suzanne Bartsch and Patricia Field, who I like to think of them as sort of leading lights of counterculture.
That's a really cool way of saying it. I think what's so interesting to me is Artgasm. I started Artgasm because I'm a sex educator and I'm an artist, and I love the kind of that interesting place where sex and culture really meet. Mm-hmm. And when I was thinking about the pieces that you write, you write about celebrity, and so you interview a lot of people, and I wonder, I was very curious to talk to you about what's your experience of how do you ask questions of someone, or sometimes maybe it's that queer people, their sexuality is always kind of there, and it's always kind of a topic of discussion because it's other, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. And so you think of people like Alan Cumming, who's well, yes, he is a bisexual actor. The bisexual part is always part of Alan Cumming's, identity in a very odd way.
Right.
So, in what way do you feel you either have to avoid or interrogate a celebrity's life around sexuality?
It's really obviously delicate, and I think, in my experience, I haven't ever profiled a celebrity who's closeted, because I think I just could not handle that. But I have profiled celebrities who have been very circumspect about their private lives, who don't want to talk about their romantic lives a lot, and you can talk about it in sort of a roundabout way. Or people who are total open books, which is great. Mm-hmm. And just to give a few examples, I did a piece on Chris Colfer about 4 or 5 years ago, from Glee. And he was someone who didn't make a big show of his identity, but he was always gay. There was no question Chris Colfer was gay. Yeah. And I wanted to ask him about it, but didn't want to be, I didn't want to scare him. Mm-hmm. So I actually found a little trick question to get him talking about it, which is that the writer Mark Harris had written a cover story for Entertainment Weekly about the new coming out for celebrities, and he had mentioned Chris Colfer in a quote about how celebrities don't need to come out anymore and have a press conference and a magazine cover and whatever. They can just some people now are coming up in a way that they're always out. And so what I did was actually wrote down that quote, read it to Chris Colfer, and said, what are your thoughts on this?
Nice.
What do you think? And he said, well, I love it. And that was kind of a way of getting into that. And then another really tricky one was Sarah Paulson, because I interviewed her around when she was on the People versus O.J. Simpson, and she had just made this big splash from dating Holland Taylor, and the tabloids were obsessing over this. Like they were going to premieres together and the Tony Awards, and everyone was just freaking out because he was hot Sarah Paulson dating like a hot older lady.
Yeah.
And this is after she had dated Cherry Jones. So it was like, what is going on? Like, and before that dated men. So it's kind of like, what is going on with Sarah Paulson? Like, what is her, like, what's the deal?
Yeah.
And, she had a publicist who was just very wary about the whole thing. And she was like, I don't want to make it a coming out piece. She's not coming out. Like, this is not what that is. And I was like, I totally understand that. And I want to ask her about Marcia Clark and make it about her work.
Yeah.
But, I also want to ask her a little bit about Holland Taylor but without making it a whole sort of retrograde, like, because she's coming out as whatever she's coming out as. So I thought really hard about that. And it turned out that Sarah, more than her publicist, was totally cool with it and like totally up for it. But we started talking about Marcia Clark and how Marcia Clark had to deal with sort of public scrutiny and how, people obsessing over her appearance, her hairstyle, all that kind of stuff while she was just doing her job, trying to be an attorney. And then I kind of transitioned from that and said, well, you are also someone who has a job that you do very well, and you are scrutinized for your own private life, but in recent weeks in a really positive way. And I'm just, what is that like for you? And then I did give her like a sort of, by the way, this is that part of the interview, because she knew it was coming. And then she just like went for it. I was like, well, how did you meet? How did this, but it was one very delicate question that I felt I had to ask was like, you've dated a lot of older people. I'm sure it's specific to each person and not something where you can generalize, but do you feel like there's some reason for that or something that connects all those experiences? And she had a beautiful answer that I was quoted, like I quoted it, it was like a paragraph long quote about the poignancy of dating an older person. And so that, that just went really well just because she was a really open person to it,
and the parallels that between Marcia Clark's experience of being scrutinized for something that's just so bizarre.
But that was me in my sort of sneaky way, just trying to transition from her work so it didn't seem totally exploitative and gossipy and random. And then I had to fight with the editors who wanted to call it coming out as herself or something, and I was like, I promised the publicist it wasn't going to be her coming out piece, so can we please not say that in the headline?
Well, it's interesting too, because there's always, obviously there's always this kind of prurient interest that people have about celebrity sex lives, but I have to wonder, in terms of the effort it takes to hide something versus just the being self, and obviously we're moving into a very different time. I would not insist that Tab Hunter had to be out, it wouldn't have been the same kind of world.
Right.
But I find it so interesting that you see some people who are trying, especially in this day and age, to be so protective of their private lives that people can't help but now want to know what they're quote unquote hiding, as opposed to just being like, I'm bi, or this is a thing, or I have an open relationship. You still don't hear about polyamorous people in celebrity. Right. But if anybody who was a theater major knows, it's just how can you possibly think that the pantheon of actors and musicians aren't a lot of poly people, a lot of queer people? People don't stop being queer when they graduate with an MFA. You know?
Absolutely. I'll tell you this: I wouldn't jump to profile John Travolta. People who I think are Kevin Spacey for that matter. I think I usually judge. People ask me what it's like to interview famous people, and I think each one of them is completely different. They have different personalities. They have different comfort levels with interviews, and you kind of have to respond to that and sort of take the ride that they're taking you on. And I've been very fortunate, I think, in interviewing a lot of people who are complete open books. But still, when you're asking someone about their romantic life, you have to ask the questions you want to ask, but realize that you're asking them of a human and not like an object.
Yeah, what an interesting. I mean, there's got to be such an art form to conversation in that way, where you're saying like you're asking questions that are kind of crafty to try and elicit a kind of response that you want, not necessarily the words that you want to hear, but you want to try and make them feel like they can step into the space that you've created. How do you develop that skill set to just like, I don't know, like create a question that feels like it can go in a lot of different directions and follow a thread that feels useful? Like you have to do that on the spot. You can't plan for that.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, my approach to interviewing is like I prepare by coming up with topics I want to hit and learning about the person's work and everything and thinking through the order that the conversation should go. But I don't over prepare because I want to be able to respond to someone's energy, respond to things they bring up, and ask follow-up questions. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just about being spontaneous and alert to what people are giving you.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. It's like right now the final 50 Shades of Grey pole dance is happening, right? The third movie just came out, and it's so interesting. It's like I remember reading interviews because I'm as a sex educator, I have a lot of friends who are into BDSM, and I remember reading the interviews. Now, a lot of sex educators have a lot of opinions about 50 Shades of Grey, the book, and the films about the way they treat BDSM.
I'm sure.
There's a long, deep rabbit hole you could go down. But I remember kind of being frustrated when I was reading about the actors talking about approaching BDSM, because they were very cavalier and very dismissive of, they did research by going to dungeons, and there's kind of this disgust that you would hear in some of these interviews about these weirdos doing this stuff. And it's like, that was just heartbreaking to me.
Yeah.
It's like, you'd like to think that, as an actor, the whole point is to like live truly. Empathize. Yeah, that's like, you're empathy artists. That's what you do. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, that's another tricky thing about writing about, well, anything but sexuality is there's always a community out there. Mm-hmm. And, I'm sure I've offended my share of people, but, you'd never want to be flippant about something but I also like being funny, and it's just really hard. And people are everyone now is like a media watchdog, on Twitter or wherever. Like everyone is like, no matter what you write, someone on Twitter will say like, "Oh, do better," and you have to. It's exhausting if you pay attention to it. I've done a couple of pieces, not a ton, for the style section that have been about sort of issues in sexuality. Like I did a piece about 5 years ago called Generation LGBTQIA, which was about how kids on college campuses are talking about gender and identity and sexuality. And it was really tricky. And then I did another one soon after that about bisexuality. It was after Tom Daley came out as bisexual. And it stirred up all that stuff of people saying, "Oh no, he's just gay." This is
he'll get over it.
And the biphobia. And I wrote sort of a reported, not a profile of him, but a piece about that more broadly. And they're
I think
very
you mentioned
tricky.
Cynthia Nixon in that too, right?
Cynthia Nixon, Alan Cumming, all these people, and how celebrities have dealt with it, but also how the biases that that bisexuals face, and people not believing that it's real or whatever. And it's really tricky to write those. That's why I don't do that often, because it's really hard. And obviously there are people out there who have really strong feelings. You can never represent everyone. Never please everyone. I remember for the piece about bisexuality, it was one thing that was tricky was I wanted to address the things that everyone says but then you're giving them giving them ink, to these biases, these sort of preconceived notions, only to thwart them, but or offer a balance, counterbalance, like here's an expert saying, no, it exists or whatever. But then you've sort of aired it again. And so it's just very hard.
It's true, and especially the bisexual piece I thought was really great, because you're talking about how important the word is. Like, you can be a bisexual person, but if you say like, well, I'm not interested in labels, a lot of people feel invisibilized by that, right? They want to know, they want a celebrity, they want somebody who says, yeah, I'm bi, this is my word, because then it helps kind of with the visibility.
Well, yeah, I think the person who was an example of that was the First Lady of New York, Charlene McRae, who I guess, I don't remember exactly what she said, but she's something like, I'm labels are for something. Like she was very anti-label. And it's kind of like, well, having a bisexual First Lady of New York would mean something.
Yeah.
having a biracial family that's the first family of New York means something. And I think that there's this pressure either way and it's very hard. Another line that people did not take the entirely right way was I said something like bisexuality like chronic fatigue syndrome is something that is often doubted by that it even exists, that you have to protest. Like, I really am. And that's because I have friends who have chronic fatigue syndrome and they are constantly going on about how I look healthy.
Yeah.
I look like there's nothing wrong, but I have chronic fatigue syndrome.
This is a real thing.
And, of course, so I just reminded me, it was so similar to me, the frustration of having to convince people that you exist in a way, or this aspect of you exists. But then, of course, people out in the world were like, oh, are you saying bisexuality is a syndrome? It's like, no, I'm not. Jesus Christ.
And likewise, neither of them can be truly cured.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I was, John Mahoney, somebody had written a piece, I can't remember, in some gay publication where they said, like, why is the media so silent on John Mahoney being an out gay man in all of his obits, right? And I was like, oh, that's such an interesting moment, because, like, apparently, and the way that the piece was talking about, like, it wasn't a defining aspect of him. It was just a thing that he was. But he also, like, stopped having sex later in his life. He just wasn't interested in it. It wasn't partnered. Just kind of, it wasn't a huge part of his life. It was just kind of another color in the crayon box. And what I think is so interesting is hearing, like, I understand the need to, like, have our queers be, like, labeled and so for visibility's sake, but I also understand, like, if sexuality is just kind of another part of your life, not that big of a deal, like, why do we also need to, like, constantly be, like, pointing a camera at it saying, see queer, this one's gay, this one's bi, and, like, I find it to be such an interesting challenge. Like, if somebody's coming out, or if somebody's getting married, or if somebody brings a new partner on the red carpet, like, I can understand the interest there, but if somebody's just like, not a defining
it can also get very prurient and retrograde. For instance, I wrote a piece a while ago about Ronan Farrow, and so it was when he was, like, first really becoming known from being funny on Twitter and stuff, and that whole thing about whether his father was Woody Allen or Frank Sinatra, and he continues to keep his private life completely quiet, and so I didn't really write about it. Like, I sort of made a reference to how he's sort of partied a lot in DC, like went to social functions and stuff with this guy, John Lovett, who was a Obama speechwriter, who might have been his boyfriend or might still be. I honestly don't know. And I just kind of alluded to it. But then there was this guy who I know, this writer, like, went on a rampage on me on Facebook, and then turned it into some column for a website, I don't remember, just talking about how like oh, I've had friends who've hooked up with him on Grindr or whatever. I don't even know if I'm talking about this, but why if I could make why can't you find out, like, as a reporter instead of just like wink it, like blowing the dog whistle. And it's like, I wanted to, and I did reach out to him and say, I mean, what do you think I should have done? Should I have, like, gone on Grindr in Washington, D.C. and found people who
like that person did with the Olympics?
People who claim that they've had sex with him and, like, put that in the article? Right. Like, that just feels like Lavender Scare, witch hunting, like that just feels like from the 1950s.
Right. And it's one thing if they're a senator voting anti-gay legislation.
Yeah, but it's like, if he's not putting it out there, and again, I'm not saying he's anything, but, because I don't know him well enough, and I didn't know as a reporter, and he wasn't offering it. I don't think it's my job to, like, find past hookups and, put that in the New York Times. I just feel like that's gross, and it feels, really prurient and retrograde to me. Like, we should have space in the culture for, like, not caring. If someone isn't doing any harm to the gay community and doesn't want to be a part of it, it's different with someone like Kevin Spacey, who came out as a defense, as like a cover for sexual assault. That's a completely different case. But I don't know, tricky.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, like, yeah, there are these aspects in which it is relevant, and I guess as a journalist, you kind of have to weigh in the moment, like, what cultural relevance does this actually have? Like, what story does this serve? Is it just click-throughs? Is it just, trying to get somebody on the record for funsies, or is it actually serving a greater purpose in illuminating a person? And, I mean, it feels like sometimes it could be one or either or both, but how do you weigh that? I mean, how do you decide? Is it just protecting privacy? Is it trying to get a full-fledged perspective on somebody where you're doing a profile?
Yeah, and it's really difficult in that case when someone, like, if are you helping them stay closeted and being sort of complicit in people being closeted versus is outing in its own way kind of homophobic? Mm-hmm. And I don't know, it's really tough.
Yeah.
That's why, again, I try to stick to people who are open books about it. It makes it a lot simpler.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, so I think that, what's interesting is it does feel in some ways the kind of the post-gender, post-sexuality, like we're just people, man, labels are for food. In what way do you think that this conversation is changing on like a grander scale around how people label, how people are attached to labels, and whether people choose to or not?
It's shifting some. I can't claim to understand everything about the younger generation. And, so this LGBTQIA piece that I did was because some editors at the style section saw that college groups that used to be gay and lesbian, and then they were LGBT, were now LGBTQIA. And like, what's the deal with that? What do those letters stand for? Like almost making fun of it. Mm. And they're like, why don't you go find some kids who like are part of a group like that and report on it? And so I actually found these amazing kids at the University of Pennsylvania who had a group called Penn Non-Cis. And they had a poetry reading that I sat in on, and I interviewed them all, and some were trans, some were agender, some were genderqueer, some were lesbians, some were gay men. And it blew me away, because this was 2013, and people didn't know the word cisgender outside of that little world, outside of academia, really, or Tumblr, wherever it was. And it was totally eye-opening to me, and I went back to the editor. I wrote my story and didn't really mention LGBTQIA, and the editors at the Times were like, well, what is this? Like, we don't understand this. Like, why don't you talk more about the letters? And I was like, well, because they're not using the letter. They're 18, and they're way past that. They're using these completely different terms that I think are really true to what's happening. And it was just like, well, will our readers understand? And so I had to sort of, and they really wanted to title it Generation LGBTQI. So I was like, fine. At the end, it was so frustrating because it's hard to write a trend piece because often the trend is decided on before the reporting bears it out or not. And so I had to sort of start out talking about the letter thing and then kind of transition and explain what cisgender meant, what, genderqueer meant, what all these things meant, and how these these college freshmen were using them, this new terminology. And I do feel like that, obviously it's, 5 years later now, we all know what cisgender means and genderqueer, and it's like a whole new world of that.
It's moving so fast. These ages of telescoping timeline. It just feels like everything's getting so much faster. So as a journalist, kind of a craft question, when you go into that kind of piece, like a trend piece, culture beat kind of piece, do you go in with kind of the naivete? Is it helpful for you to say, like, so what is cisgender to you kind of stuff? Or do you try and get a lot of research done so that you can come in at their level? What tends to work?
Well, I will say that an underrated interview tactic is to ask a really dumb question. Because then you just get people explaining things. And sometimes being too smarty pants and too sophisticated can... I don't know. It doesn't always get you what you need. So, I certainly tried to learn about it, but I also knew what I didn't know. I think arrogance is a real demerit as a journalist. It really shuts you off. So I didn't pretend like I knew more than I did. And I really learned a lot. I mean, these kids were so smart, and they're so well-spoken. They were 18. They blew me away. They were completely different than I was when I was a college freshman. And they had such sophisticated views on gender, on politics, I was so impressed, I was so, I just thought they were great, and I tried to represent what they were like, and the way they talked.
It was a great piece. I love it. I tend to teach in universities a lot, and I'm always blown away. I'm actually kind of blown away by both. In some ways, they're still kids, right? And I definitely had the experience of when I first started teaching sex ed at universities, thinking that because these kids grew up with the internet, they would know so much more than I did when I was their age.
Yeah.
And again, I'm using the word kids, but many of them are adults, young adults. But at the same time, like, just because they have access to porn, and they've had access to porn since they were 12, right, doesn't mean that they actually know anything about sex or gender, and they're still in the same kind of inquiry with themselves. They might just have a couple more words for it. I didn't have the words, so I was like, oh, I must be bisexual because that's the only other option, right? That's the only thing that defines what I like. But now, if I were coming of age, I'd probably have like 18 different things, and I could create this like beautiful little collage of identity. So there is this naivety, but there also is this access to information that I find is so interesting. What I find really beautiful, especially teaching them about sex, is that like they have all the information. They know all the definitions of the words, but there's still this gap often of getting from the knowing, the book learning, to the actual like living and breathing and understanding myself, right? And oftentimes my job is to get them shorten their learning curve there, to figure out, like, help them understand, okay, so I know that these are the things that I identify as, but that, how can I use that knowledge to make connection with people easier, or to talk to somebody about what pleasure feels like to me, how to touch my body specifically, or to even have a conversation about what kind of relationship I want, right?
Right.
A lot of these kids are asking for like workshops on relationship skills because you can't learn that from porn.
Right.
And it's fascinating to watch, like, oh, it's the same. Teenagers are the same everywhere around the world.
Do you feel like the whole conversation about consent is kind of drowning that stuff out? Because obviously that's something that is such a huge topic that is so pressing. But I haven't heard anything about people learning about pleasure or relationships, like I've heard so much about how people are teaching, enthusiastic yes or whatever.
Yeah, well, I think there's this panic that's happening on university campuses where people are trying to, meet their Title IX requirements around sexual assault, and also make sure that kids aren't hurting each other. And so it's kind of the same as sex ed 20 years ago, whereas instead of figuring out how to not knock somebody up, it's how to figure out not how to sexually assault somebody. So it's still fear-based, it's still reactionary-based, and that's disheartening. I think it's obviously these conversations are essential. People should know how not to get pregnant, and people should know how not to sexually assault each other. That's, I think, fairly obvious. But there is, I think, some administrators, the really hip ones, are starting to notice, actually, we need to talk about pleasure. Actually, we need to talk about anatomy from a pleasure point of view, not from a reproduction point of view. These are where the gaps of knowledge are. I do think that consent, the conversation right now, this cultural moment, is so reactionary and terrified. Everyone is scared to talk about this stuff. And we talk about it from a perspective of, like, the soup of gender expectations, right? I think with the Aziz Ansari, we just started talking about how men and women are taught to treat sex, where it's like women are gatekeepers and men are taught to keep pursuing until shut down, and that it's everyone's fault and no one's fault. I think what's hard right now is that we're not able to talk about this we haven't quite yet gotten to the sophistication of the conversation where we're talking about it from anything other than a predator and prey situation, right? We're not talking about how confusing it is to have somebody not tell you no, but kind of giggle and shuffle away. And like, for me, as someone who sleeps with women, like, I've had that experience. I've had a girl not tell me no, but also I don't know what to read around that. And so, I'm taught to, like, interrupt the whole flow and then, like, have a conversation. But even then, like, we say, like, no means no, yes means yes, but that's actually not the full story. Yes doesn't always mean yes, and this is getting really in the weeds. And I think as a culture, we're just starting to have this conversation. And I think a lot of us, even adults, especially adults, people who had muddy, weird sexual encounters when they were young and they don't consider it sexual assault, now they're having younger people say, "Oh, that was sexual assault," and you're like, "How am I supposed to feel about that? How am I supposed to recontextualize my entire sexual history now that I know what I know about gender and expectations?" It's intense, dude.
I bet. Oh my goodness.
And I mean, it feels like good work, but it's scary. And I mean, I'm very hopeful for these groups that you talk about, right? The non-cis and all these groups of young people who are committed to trying to figure that out. Right now, I feel like I see a lot of young people who are committed to understanding restorative justice, right? So it's not about, because you can't, like, if you are committed to social justice, you can't be also committed to, like, penal justice, right? You can't say, like, oh, well, like, we have to understand how race and sex and gender are all intertwined in our society and still say, oh, yeah, so-and-so should be excised from the community or so-and-so should be prosecuted, right? Because if you're against the carceral system, you have to be against the carceral system, which is a really complicated place to be.
Sure is.
So I'm seeing a lot of people try and use the kinds of restorative justice models that exist for, like, crime, right? Like, the family of a murder victim meets the murderer and they talk about it, right? This stuff that there is technology for. There are people who've been doing this for a very long time. We're trying to figure out how to apply that to smaller, less violent encounters, like sexual assault, like confusing sexual encounters that wouldn't qualify as assault, or like just, I felt bad when you did that. How do we use restorative justice in those communities to say, like, okay, there was a misinterpretation and somebody got hurt. How do we heal that hurt with the community?
Yeah.
It's complex.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
But it's amazing.
Yeah. You know, one of the other things that because I think it's really important to try to learn from young people, and I have had that experience as a journalist. I mean, one topic that we haven't really touched on that I've written a bunch about and had to learn a lot about is transgender stuff, transgender lives and experiences. Just even doing profiles. I wrote a New Yorker profile of Hari Neff, the model and actor, a New York Times piece about Justin Vivian Bond. It's so, there's obviously been a lot of media attention in the last couple of years. A lot of it has been very nuanced and great. Some of it's been awful. There's been Caitlyn Jenner in the middle of it, and language is so important for that. And so as a writer, you have to really be aware of how you're using language. Justin Vivian Bond goes by the pronoun V. Now, the New York Times wouldn't let me use the pronoun V.
Whoa.
Because it's not a word. It's not a style, style guide. And they also use Mr. and Ms. for people's last names. And Justin goes by Mix. And they, that's not, I couldn't do that. So
what'd you do?
So it was like a short piece. It was like 1,000 words. And what I ended up doing is just writing the whole thing in sentences where I didn't use any personal pronouns at all. So it was a lot of strange passive voice. I couldn't have done it for much more than 1,000 words, but I managed to just it was like a puzzle. It was like that French novel that doesn't contain the letter E, but like easier. But it was like it was a puzzle, just to get around using him or her or V, because I couldn't use that. And then I had to go up to the standards editor about just saying Bond instead of Mr. or Ms. or Mix Bond, because I think maybe they've changed it now and they've used Mix. I've seen other articles about Justin, but that was really tricky. And then Hari Neff is someone who is much younger than me and is so intelligent, and I don't know if you know much about her, but she was on Transparent.
I saw her on Transparent,
and has been very big in the fashion world. And, to ask her about her experience and to do a long, long New Yorker profile, was like 5,000 words. I just really had to educate myself. And, I think there's a tendency for journalists to sort of say, well, I'm not going to play by all the rules that the transgender community is demanding because it's annoying. And I try to just do it. Like I'm not out to anger anyone. And, but I do think, okay, for instance, I didn't mention I didn't mention her birth name, and there aren't a lot of profiles of transgender people that skip that part because people think it's important. You know, she was born blah blah blah, and
like, does every Tom Cruise interview mention Tom Cruise's birth name? Like, come on, like that's such a strange thing.
So I did, I got a question from my editor at the New Yorker. They're like, should we say? And I was like, well, it's cooler not to. It's like the hip thing to do, not to do it, and if we do it, like it'll hurt her feelings. She won't like it, and it'll get the community angry. So why waste all that goodwill that we might have on something that isn't truly necessary to the story? If people want to know, they can Google it or something.
Right.
But I don't think it's the most important thing.
Well, yes, because I guess it kind of comes down to what you consider your job to be, right? Like if you're trying to illuminate something that maybe not understood, why wouldn't you play by the rules set by the community that you're talking about? Like, it feels like that would be more illuminating. I mean, even if you can turn that into teaching moments like, well, they call this dead naming, and dead naming is a really offensive thing to do to people.
Yeah.
Like, then it becomes like, well, now you're actually letting readers understand something on a deeper level than maybe like, oh, here's a celebrity profile. It's like, well, actually, like, let's talk about how all of this integrates to how somebody shows up in the world.
Yeah. And I did do it earlier. When I did the LGBTQIA, I mentioned Stephen Ira, the son of Warren Beatty, and Annette Bening, who's a really smart, eloquent poet and Twitter presence and everything. Young kid who has a lot to say and is super great. And I put his dead name in the piece, kind of out of ignorance. I just sort of put it there, and he wrote to me and said that here's why I don't like that. And it's annoying to get an email like that because you think, well, it's public information, blah blah. Your defenses go up, and you're like, well, I think it's it serves the reader, blah blah blah. There's a million things you could say, and then but then when I got to the next opportunity with Hari Neff, I just thought, well, maybe I'll just do what they're telling us they want, and not hurt anyone's feelings.
Yeah.
And if there are sort of readers out there who are confused by it, then they'll read up on it and deal.
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, I find that sometimes it's very exhausting to keep up with the language because something that was de rigueur one day somehow becomes offensive, and saying it, 3 months later is now you're perpetuating blah-de-blah-de-blah.
Right.
But at the same time, I do think that there is, when the technology exists, so to speak, the idea of one of the language things around transness that you often hear is when somebody says they were quote unquote born a woman, and there was a lot of pushback from the trans community saying no one's born a woman. What are you talking? They didn't come out of the womb fully fledged adults. That's actually clunky to say. That's imprecise language. It's grammatically problematic. It's just problematic.
Yeah.
And so what I think is fun is having writers, having to learn how to adjust their language actually, I think, improves the way we think about language and the way we think about, how important is it that they is a plural pronoun versus a singular one. And you have these lexicographers who are actually digging in saying, actually, they does have a precedence for being a singular pronoun, but we lost it somehow in the way. We're claiming that. And I love that when the word nerds get involved and they can say well, language is a living thing. We don't have to codify it in 1948 and only use that. The rules are ours to create and change.
I mean, it can be painful for me as a grammar nerd sometimes, but
But yeah, I think it's a really valuable thing. Well, I think what I love about journalism is good journalists is, I think, that underlying curiosity, right? You have to be curious about people, else why would you do this kind of work? How could you do this work? How could you show up and not want to talk to people,
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of goes back to the John Waters thing, because I loved watching you flit around a camp and be like, that person looks interesting, and then you're like, hey, can we talk?
I have to tell you, though, so part of writing for in the New Yorker, they let you print basically anything. The Times is a little more buttoned up about language, and they censor me. Not censor, but I can't use curse words in it, and there's a lot of language that they say, oh, it's a family newspaper. And that article was so hard to write They didn't let me use circle jerk because the first night John Waters came out and was talking about when he was a camper, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I remember being a camper in Baltimore, and that's where I learned what circle jerk was." And I put that quote in, and my editor changed it to like. Then he talked about more PG rated activities,
Aww.
and I was so sad to lose that. But then you actually had a quote that got watered down because I remember the costume night.
Mm-hmm.
There were a bunch of people dressed as Crybaby, and I remember you said it's the easiest thing for dykes to pull off, which I put in the piece as a quote. And then they changed it; they took it out of quotes and said it's the easiest thing for lesbians to put off. One woman said, and I was like, you can't use dyke if a dyke is saying it.
Yeah.
And that just broke my heart a little bit.
It's true. Yeah.
Sadly.
I remember reading the quote. I'm like, did I say lesbian? I don't think.
No, of course you didn't.
That's why
Of course you didn't. It's totally not as funny,
totally
or apt, but
I'm sad that they couldn't just use like a bunch of asterisks. I guess the whole piece would have just been asterisks.
They don't do asterisks, and that's another thing. You can't even imply. You can't do F asterisk, but man, it can twist you up a knot sometimes, especially if you're covering John Waters' camp. I mean, Jesus Christ.
That was a good impersonation, by the way. That was pretty good.
You like my John Waters?
That's pretty good. I'm impressed.
That's why I learned where a circle jerk was.
So I have to ask the question that you always ask, interviewers and journalists, like, what's the dream piece? What's the dream subject?
That I haven't done?
Yeah.
Oh, God. Yeah, I don't know. I have a bunch of them, I guess. I don't know. I wrote a whole book about Meryl Streep and didn't even really get to meet her. So
really?
She's my dream subject.
So wait, you didn't meet her for the book?
I met her once for a New Yorker piece, but very briefly. And then I wrote a book about her as, I guess, unauthorized. I mean, she knew about it and she sort of let me do my research, but didn't want to be interviewed. So I still have a million questions I'd love to ask her.
Wow.
I just got to meet Helen Mirren, which was so exciting.
Oh,
I love my actress. I'm an actress sexual, and I've gotten to meet a lot of them, like Tilda Swinton and Cate Blanchett, who I'd love to interview more.
Oh, God.
But there's still, there are a bunch on my list of the great actresses that I've
when I was digging on pieces that you wrote to prepare for this, I saw that you interviewed Jane Lynch, right? Or did you just?
Yeah.
So I had a huge crush on Jane Lynch. I actually worked with her. She's on the board of the center where I used to work, and so I would always be close to her in this way where I'm like, she wasn't super famous yet, and so I was like, I just have to get up the courage to hit on her. She's like really friendly. She lives in my neighborhood. And then, like, I finally got the courage up, and, like, I think the night before I was going to see her at a fundraiser, and I was going to say, like, let's go out for coffee. I saw the piece in the Times where she was engaged, and I'm like, no!
Oh, she's off the market.
She will always be the one that got away from me. And also, she also became very famous very fast around that, where it's like, she was, like, awesome. I knew her from Best in Show, and then, like, Glee happened. And then I'm like, goodbye, girl that I could hit on but can't because now you are famous, and now that's just weird.
Maybe someday.
Still holding out hope for Jane.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was fun. I actually wrote about it in one of my books about, like, this is a cautionary tale to all of you who want to hit on somebody but are scared to do it.
Do it now. They might be on Glee. They might wind up on Glee tomorrow.
And then that ship will have sailed.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Michael. So, thanks for joining me. This was lovely.
It was lovely.
So nice
Thanks for having me.
Yay.
Great to see you again, camp friend.
Camp friend. Awesome. Perfect.
And that is it for this episode of the Artgasm Podcast. Thank you, as always, for joining me. If you are enjoying what you're hearing and you'd like to hear more, consider becoming a patron of mine at patreon.com/artgasm. That's patreon.com/artgasm, because there I record more episodes, and I'm really, really close to $100 a month, which is my very basic goal, so I can get transcripts of these podcasts online, which help for searchability, help for people finding the podcast, and also help for accessibility purposes. So please do check that out. And I'm still trying to fundraise to get a new microphone so that interviews like Michael's can be in much more elegant sounding tones as opposed to a little bit hollow and a little bit tinny. me. So that's the thing that I'm doing as well. As always, reach out to me if you'd like to share your thoughts or ask a question on Twitter at HeyAllieMoon. That's HeyAllieMoon. Or find me anywhere on the interwebs. You can do it anywhere on the interwebs. My name's Allison Moon. You can find me. I believe in you. Until next time, thanks so much for joining me. Bye-bye.